The desert wind had no mercy. It scoured the dry land like a cruel whisper, pulling at the edges of Clara Morgan's bonnet as she knelt under the punishing sun. Her hands, blistered and cracked, trembled around the handle of the rusted shovel. She jammed into the hard-packed earth. Every strike was weaker than the last, her body rebelling against the heat, the hunger, and the weight of the child inside her. She paused, panting, wiping her face with a frayed sleeve. The sky above was an endless, ruthless blue. No clouds, no hope of rain. Round her, the broken remnants of a dream lay scattered, a crumbling adobe shack with holes in the roof, a corral with one bent gate, and a dry, dusty well that had coughed up its last drop 3 weeks ago. Clara glanced down at her swollen belly. 8 months. Her baby kicked lightly, and she whispered, "Hang on a little longer, sweetheart. Mama's trying." That was all she had left. Her husband, Roy, had died in a stampede 2 months back. The cattle crushed him before he ever had a chance to scream. His family had shown up at the funeral with cold eyes and legal papers, claiming every head of livestock and all the ranch's equipment. "Roy's dead," they said. "Your baby doesn't change that." But Clara had one thing they didn't want: the land, or rather, what was left of it. She'd begged to keep the broken-down homestead, and they'd let her, certain she wouldn't survive more than a few weeks. They hadn't been far off. The last of the water ran out 2 days ago. Her tongue was thick and dry. Her fingers shook from dehydration. But something inside her refused to stop. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was madness. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the fierce, unrelenting hope of a mother who still believed she could bring her child into the world with dignity. She stabbed the shovel into the dirt again, muscles burning. The ground gave a little, just enough to fool her into thinking there might be moisture deeper down. She dropped to her knees and clawed at the soil with her hands. Dust, always dust. A dizzy wave of heat slammed into her skull. Her vision swam. She fell forward, forehead hitting the dirt. Somewhere far off, she thought she heard hoofs, slow, steady, deliberate. Maybe thunder, maybe hallucination. The world blurred to a golden haze. Then darkness. When Clara blinked awake, everything felt quieter, cooler. She wasn't in the sun anymore. Her lips were damp. Someone had pressed a wet cloth to her mouth. She opened her eyes slowly. He stood in the doorway of the shack, silhouetted against the sunset like a figure from a dream. Broad-shouldered, dust-covered, still as a statue. A battered cowboy hat shadowed most of his face, but she could see the sharp edge of his jaw, the dark stubble, and the set of his mouth firm. Unsmiling, she tried to sit up, but her limbs wouldn't cooperate. Her throat cracked as she whispered, "Water." He stepped forward, holding out a battered tin cup. His gloved hand never touched hers as he passed it. She drank slowly, greedily, letting the cool liquid run down her throat like salvation. When she was done, she gasped, "Thank you." He nodded once. His silence was strange, but not threatening. He didn't feel like a man who wanted something. He felt like a ghost, like a man who'd come to watch her die, only to decide against it at the last minute. "I don't have anything," she said weakly. "No food, barely any shelter, just me and you." She touched her stomach. "This one, still." He said nothing. He looked around the tiny cabin, a pile of kindling in the corner, a broken window patched with cloth, one stool, one cot, one desperate woman. He removed his hat and set it on the floor. Then he turned and walked back out the door. Panic surged in Clara's chest. "Wait," she cried. "Are you leaving?" No answer. She tried to stand, but her legs gave out. She leaned against the wall, tears of helplessness burning her eyes. After everything, he was gone. But then she heard it again. The creak of old wood, the splash of water, and moments later, the sound of something being dragged, something heavy. The door creaked open. The cowboy returned with an armload of chopped wood and a bucket of water. He moved without sound, without explanation. He set the firewood near the hearth, poured water into the dented basin, checked the window and tightened the cloth patch with a piece of twine from his saddlebag. Clara watched him like he was a mirage. "You don't talk much," she murmured. He glanced at her. His eyes were dark, unreadable, but there was something. There's something tired. He shook his head. "Just once, can't, or won't." No answer, only silence. She didn't push. Somehow, it didn't matter. She didn't even know his name. But that night, as she lay on the cot wrapped in her thin quilt, she watched him sit near the door, one hand resting lightly on the rifle at his side, and for the first time in weeks, she felt something she thought she'd lost. Safe, not saved. Not yet, but safe enough to close her eyes without fear, safe enough to sleep, and somewhere In the deepest corner of her heart, a spark of hope began to flicker. Morning came quietly, as it often did in the desert, with the pale light seeping in. Through the patched window, Clara opened her eyes slowly, blinking at the soft rays brushing her face. For a moment, she wasn't sure if the events of the day before had been real. Had a silent cowboy really appeared out of the shimmering heat and saved her from dying in the dirt? Then she saw him seated on the porch just beyond the open door, still, watchful, as if he'd been there all night. The sight stirred something strange in her, a mix of unease and comfort. She struggled to sit up, every muscle in her body aching from the exhaustion and dehydration. The cool water in the basin near the hearth caught her eye, and she reached for it gratefully, splashing some on her face and sipping from the ladle outside. The wind had quieted, the sky was a cloudless blue, and the man still no name, no words, sat motionless with his back to her, one knee propped, one hand lazily resting on the rifle across his lap. Clara took a deep breath, steeled herself, and stepped out onto the porch. Her bare feet touched the cool planks, and he didn't turn, didn't flinch. She lowered herself into the rocking chair beside him. He finally looked her way. Morning, she said softly, a slow nod, no smile. She studied him closer now. Beneath the wide-brimmed hat, she caught more detail, deeply tanned skin, creases around his eyes that spoke of years under harsh sun, and a scar, a faint slash across his cheekbone that looked old but not forgotten. You're not much for talk, are you? Again, just a faint shake of his head. I suppose that's fine, Clara murmured. I've done enough talking to myself lately. He turned his gaze back to the horizon, where the land rolled out in waves of gold and dust. She followed his eyes. The ridge in the distance shimmered under the morning sun, and for the first time, she noticed something strange: hoofprints, leading away from her homestead, back toward the hills. How did you find me? She asked. No answer. Were you passing through? No nod, no shake, just silence. She exhaled slowly. There was a strange calm in the air, one she hadn't felt since Roy's death. She wasn't used to it. In fact, she didn't know what to do with it. Most men don't stop for women like me, she said, resting a hand on her swollen belly. Especially not out here, not alone. Either they pretend not to see, or they come close with bad intentions. But you, she trailed off, unsure of how to finish the thought. But you didn't touch me. You didn't ask for anything. You just helped. The man finally stood, stretching his back and letting out the faintest grunt, almost a human sound, not just a shadow's echo. Then, he picked up the bucket and walked toward the spring again, disappearing beyond the scrub. Clara watched him go. Who was he? Later that day, she found him in the back of the property, standing beside what used to be the barn. His horse, a large black gelding with intelligent eyes, stood tethered under the shade of a mesquite tree. The man had stripped off his outer coat and was sorting through salvaged timber and broken beams. He was rebuilding the barn. Clara blinked. You planning on staying a while? This time, he met her eyes and gave the smallest of shrugs, like he wasn't sure either. But he didn't stop working. I suppose I owe you more than just water, she said, crossing her arms over her belly. That well out back, I thought I could dig deep enough to find something, but I was wrong. That spring you're pulling from, how far? He lifted 2 fingers. Maybe 2 miles, she whistled. You carried that much water from 2 miles away? He nodded once. Her voice softened. Why? A pause. Then his voice, low and rough, like it hadn't been used in days. Didn't want to find you dead. She froze. It wasn't just the words, it was the weight behind them. He had seen death, lived beside it, maybe even caused it. And something about seeing her out there in the desert had cracked something in him. Clara, she said finally. My name's Clara Morgan. The man looked at her, thoughtful, then quietly replied, Weston. No last name, just that. Weston. It suited him, short, hard, unadorned. She offered a tired smile. Thank you, Weston, for everything. He tipped his head once and went back to work. That night, Clara cooked the last of her cornmeal over the fire. Weston brought a rabbit he'd trapped, skinned and dressed without saying a word. They shared the meal on the porch as the stars began to bloom above them. She watched him more than she ate. He didn't seem dangerous, but he wasn't harmless either. There was steel in him, something honed and sharp. Yet when she moved slowly, wincing from her back pain, his eyes flicked to her with concern, subtle. That night, as she lay in bed listening to the distant call of coyotes, she found her thoughts drifting not to Roy, not to fear, but to Weston, the stranger who showed up when all hope had withered. Not because he had to, because something in Him refused to let her die. And that it changed everything. The wind had shifted. It was subtle, but Clara felt it. In the way the curtains stirred when no breeze blew. In the warmth left behind in the water bucket each morning. In the quiet but steady rhythm of Weston's footsteps around the property. It had been 3 days since he rode in out of nowhere and gave her water, firewood, and safety. Since then, the house, if one could still call it that, had changed. The roof no longer leaked where the night wind once whispered through. The door now latched without effort. The broken fence around the chicken pen had been mended, even though there weren't any chickens left to keep in. Weston never said much. He answered direct questions in the fewest words possible. He disappeared into the hills before dawn and returned by evening with something useful: firewood, a rabbit, nails, even an old horseshoe she could use to hang pots. Clara never saw where he went or what he did out there. She also never asked, because the truth was she didn't know who he was. Not really, not where he came from, not what he was running from. But she also knew something else. She wouldn't have survived without him. That morning, she stood at the stove, slowly stirring a thin corn porridge while Weston repaired a shutter near the window. His movements were fluid, precise, everything about him, his silence, his efficiency, his calm was too practiced, too perfect. "You've done this before," she said without turning. A pause. "Done what?" She glanced over her shoulder. "Built things, repaired homesteads, patched roofs." "I've lived," she frowned. "Lived where?" He didn't answer, just drove the last nail into the wood and adjusted the shutter until it sat flush. Clara returned to the stove, chewing on his reply. She'd lived in the West long enough to know the types of men who didn't talk about their pasts. Some had buried families, others had buried secrets, and a few had buried people. Still, Weston didn't feel like a threat, not to her, not to the baby. But trust was harder than it used to be, especially now. Later that afternoon, as the sun burned high in the sky, Clara sat on the porch sewing a tear in her only remaining dress. Her needlework was clumsy. Roy had always joked that she could sew a cow's ear to its tail and not notice, but she tried her best. Weston sat nearby, sharpening a blade. The metallic sound of whetstone against steel was oddly soothing. She broke the silence. "Where'd you get the name Weston?" He paused in his sharpening, looked out across the land. "My mother, she's still alive." "No, your father." Another pause. "Don't know, didn't want to." Clara tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "So you're a wanderer, then?" He nodded slightly. "A man without a past," she said quietly, "or one he doesn't speak of." This time he met her eyes. "I speak of it when it's earned." That made her blink. "You mean, when someone's earned the right to hear it?" "Yes." She held his gaze for a moment. It wasn't harsh, that look, just firm, measured, like a man who'd built walls out of necessity and didn't knock them down just because someone offered kindness. Still, something in her admired that. She nodded and went back to her stitching. Later that day, Clara went into the root cellar to check on what remained of her supplies. There wasn't much: some spoiled potatoes, a half sack of oats, and a single jar of blackberry preserves from the season before Roy died. When she returned, Weston was in the small garden patch, using a hoe to turn over the dry soil. The earth cracked like bone under the tool, resisting every movement. Yet he worked without complaint. "You're not just helping out of kindness," she said, stepping forward. He paused and looked at her. "You're hiding from something," she continued, "not unkindly, or someone." A long silence. Then, he said, "A man who can't speak his name isn't running. He's escaping." She tilted her head. "That sounds the same to me." "It's not." He looked at her belly then. The baby moved just as he did, as if responding to the shift in tone. Clara pressed a hand over her bump. "You afraid of him?" Weston asked quietly. "Roy's family." He nodded. "Not anymore," she said. "They think I'm already dead out here. They'll never come back. And anyone else?" She hesitated. There had been a man, Harlandick, a neighboring rancher with too much money and not enough decency. He had offered to buy the land 2 weeks after Roy's funeral, in exchange for something Clara would never give. When she refused, he warned her that the desert had a habit of burying the proud. She hadn't seen him since, but he was the kind of man who waited for weakness. There might be, she admitted. Weston's jaw tightened, and he returned to tilling the soil. His silence didn't feel cold, it felt like a promise. One he didn't need to say aloud. That night, over a meal of roasted rabbit and wild onions, Clara caught herself watching him again. The firelight carved deep shadows across his face, highlighting the ridge of his cheekbone, the line of his throat, the scar near his jaw. He looked like a man who had been carved out of hardship. "Why are you still here?" she asked softly. "You've helped. I can manage now." He didn't look at her as he spoke. "Storm's coming." She furrowed her brow. "You mean the wind?" He shook his head. "No, the kind with guns." The words settled like dust between them. So he knew. Somehow, he'd already sensed what she'd tried to ignore, that danger wasn't far. That someone, somewhere, would come looking. Clara leaned back and rested her hands over her belly. "Then I'm glad you're here," she whispered. For the first time, Weston looked at her not with suspicion or calculation, but something softer, something that hinted at sorrow, and maybe even hope. He didn't answer, but he didn't leave either. And in the silence that followed, Clara understood something deeply important. This man was not just shelter, he was warning. And maybe, just maybe, It was the fourth night Weston Kane stayed without saying much, and the silence was starting to take shape. Clara Morgan sat alone by the fire. Her needle paused mid-stitch as she glanced toward the door where Weston leaned against the frame. He always kept his back to the wood, always faced the land, always watched the horizon like it might come alive and strike without warning. He'd barely spoken since the moment he arrived. Just a few words here and there, yes, no. Storm's coming. She didn't know his past, didn't know if he had kin, or enemies, or regrets, but she knew this. He was haunted. The kind of haunted that made a man sleep with one eye open. The kind that didn't come from what the world did to you but from what you did to it. The cabin creaked as the desert wind slid against its walls. Clara rose from her chair slowly, cradling her belly, and walked to the table. The firelight flickered over Weston's rifle, which leaned beside the door within easy reach. She poured a cup of hot water from the kettle and held it out to him. He hesitated, then took it. Their hands brushed. He didn't flinch. "You act like someone's chasing you," she said quietly. Weston didn't answer. She stepped a little closer. "I've seen men like you before at trading posts, on the trail, sitting at the back of saloons with their hats low and their guns ready. The kind who disappear when the sun goes down. You got the same look." Still, he said nothing. "You're not just hiding out here because it's quiet," she pressed. "Something happened, something that keeps you silent." A long pause, then, in a voice low as gravel, he said, "Talking won't change it." She blinked. It was the first time in 2 days he'd spoken at all. Clara sat slowly in the rocking chair again. "Maybe not, but it might help you sleep." Weston gave a slow shake of his head. "Sleep's not something I earn." She swallowed hard at that. There was a weight in his words that made her chest tighten, like the sound of someone who had lost everything, someone who didn't believe in redemption anymore. She looked down at her hands. "My husband died in a cattle stampede," she said, softly. "He was a good man, stubborn, loud, and terrible with tools, but he loved this land, and me. We didn't have much, but I thought we'd build something, thought we'd raise a family, grow old together." Weston didn't interrupt. He didn't even move, but something in the lines of his shoulders shifted. He was trying to rescue a calf that got caught in the fence. "The herd spooked. I saw it happen. I was too far to stop it." Clara looked up, her eyes shining but steady. "I buried him behind the barn, alone. No preacher, no friends, just me and God. Then Roy's brothers showed up with a deed and a pair of pistols and took everything but this shack. They told me I'd be dead in a month." She smiled bitterly. "I guess they were almost right." Weston looked at her, then not with pity, but with understanding. "I didn't mean to survive," she whispered. "I just didn't know how to give up." He held her gaze a moment longer, then turned back toward the dark. "You shouldn't be alone out here." She shrugged. "No one else volunteered." He was quiet again, but not like before. This silence felt different, less like a wall, more like a wound. She dared another question. "Was it a woman?" He didn't reply. Clara lowered her voice. "You lost someone, didn't you?" His jaw flexed. She waited. Finally, he spoke softly, as if afraid the words would betray him. "Wife, and a son." Clara's heart sank. "I'm so sorry. They died during childbirth," he said, flat, hollow. "Midwife came late. Snowstorm blocked the trail." I held her hand while she bled out, watched my boy take 2 breaths before he stopped. Clara swallowed. Her throat ached. "Weston, I was gone after that," he continued. "Walked out. Left the grave and everything behind. Couldn't look at the house. Couldn't speak her name." A long silence passed between them, heavy as a thundercloud. "That's why you stayed, isn't it?" Clara asked. "You saw me out there pregnant, alone, and you couldn't let it happen again." He didn't confirm it, but he didn't deny it either. "That's not weakness, Weston," she said gently. "That's mercy. He set down the tin cup and turned toward her slowly. It's guilt, she stood, her hand on the small of her aching back. It's strength, you didn't run this time. He looked at her, eyes shadowed with years of pain. You stayed, she whispered. He nodded once. That night, Clara lay in bed longer than usual. She couldn't sleep. Her thoughts churned out in the main room. Weston sat near the fire, head bowed, eyes closed, but he didn't sleep either. She could feel the change between them now. It wasn't just survival. It wasn't just need. It was something like trust. It was something like two people who had broken in different ways, learning how not to be afraid of the cracks, and maybe, just maybe, learning how to let the light in. The storm rolled in without warning. One moment, the sky stretched wide and open, a canvas of dusty blue. The next, it turned the color of old gunmetal, bruised with low, swirling clouds. Clara stood on the porch, one hand pressed to the arch of her lower back, staring at the strange ripple in the air across the distant ridges. Wind picked up fast, angrier than the usual desert gusts. It hit in sharp, spiraling gusts that sent dry leaves flying across the yard and rattled the garden fence Weston had built just days before. She turned toward the barn and shouted, "Weston!" Before she finished his name, he was already running toward her from the corral, where he'd been mending a harness. The look on his face wasn't fear, it was focus. She'd seen that look in men, during droughts and cattle drives. He was measuring the risk, planning the next move. "What is it?" she called over the sudden roar of the wind. "Sandstorm," he shouted back. "Get inside. Stuff the cracks. Dampen the cloth at the windows." Clara's heart jumped. She'd heard stories about the desert storms, how they rolled in like monsters, swallowing everything in sight, blinding man and beast alike. But this was no story. This was real. The first wave of sand hit before she got inside. It blew like needles against her arms and face as she stumbled into the cabin, coughing and gasping, eyes burning. Weston slammed the door behind her and dropped the heavy beam across it. Without missing a beat, he grabbed wet rags from the basin and shoved them into the cracks along the windows. The wind howled like a banshee outside, and grit hissed across the roof and walls. Clara dropped into a chair, one hand on her belly, the other trying to breathe past the sudden surge of panic. Weston knelt in front of her. "You all right?" She nodded shakily. "I think so, just a little scared." His eyes scanned her face. "Stay seated. Breathe slow. I've never seen one of these before." "It'll pass," he said, and this time his voice softened, just a little. "But it'll fight you first." He moved quickly after that, checking the hearth, securing the shutters, laying a blanket at the threshold. Sand still seeped through the edges of the door in thin, stubborn streams, but the worst was kept outside, the cabin filled with dim, golden haze. The fire died out. The world narrowed to the tiny space they held between four walls and rising fear. Hours passed. The wind didn't let up. The sound was deafening, sand scraping like claws across the cabin, the creak of wood straining, the occasional loud thud of some unknown object striking the roof. Through it all, Clara sat by the hearth, wrapped in a quilt, eyes wide and unblinking. Weston didn't leave her side. At one point, the baby kicked hard. Clara sucked in a sharp breath, gripping the edge of the chair. Weston leaned forward. "What is it?" "Just a strong one," she said through gritted teeth. "Not labor, just pressure." He hesitated, then placed a hand gently on hers. She looked up, startled. "Tell me what to do if it starts," he said, voice rough but steady. "What you need, I'll do it." The offer hit her like a wave. He meant it, and it scared her more than the storm. She nodded slowly, her heart thudding. "I will, but I don't think tonight's the night." "Good." Another gust of wind screamed outside. Somewhere, something broke a beam, a fence. She couldn't tell. She shivered. "I've never felt so cut off from the world." "You're not," Weston said. "You've got for walls a fire pit." "Me." She looked at him, the flickering lantern between them casting shadows across his face. "You weren't meant to be alone through this," he added, more to himself than to her. "No woman should be." Clara blinked. "Were you there when your wife gave birth?" His jaw tightened. "I was." She waited. "I was there when she died, too." Clara reached out, placed a hand gently on his arm. "You don't have to carry it alone." "I do," he said quietly, "but I'll carry it differently this time." Their eyes met. And for a moment, the storm outside faded. It was still there, still angry, but inside the cabin, the wind couldn't reach them. Only the silence remained. But it was no longer the haunted kind. It was the kind shared between two people who understood each other's broken edges and didn't try to smooth them down. By dawn, the wind had died. The world beyond the cabin was buried in a thin layer of dust. Fences were knocked down. The garden was stripped bare. The air still tasted like sand. But Clara and Weston stepped out together, tired, sore, blinking into the pale morning light. The sun was rising again. They had made it, and in that strange hush after the storm, Clara felt something she hadn't in months, not just safety, not just survival, but a deep, unspoken bond with the man beside her. He had stayed, and through the storm, something inside both of them had shifted, not fixed, not. The storm had passed, but not without leaving its mark. The land looked stripped bare, as if the wind had clawed away everything that made it feel alive. Clara stood at the edge of the porch, watching dust swirl across the broken corral fence. The garden Weston had worked so hard to start was flattened, and the barn's door hung askew. But she wasn't looking at the damage, she was looking at the man beside her. Weston, tall and silent, had been surveying the perimeter since sunrise. He hadn't said much, not that he ever did, but his movements had changed. He checked the rifle twice. He moved slower, more deliberate, as if expecting something or someone to step out of the morning shadows. Clara finally broke the silence. You've been tense since dawn. He didn't look at her. Tracks, out past the spring. Her heart skipped. What kind of tracks? Boots, two sets, weren't there before the storm? Clara turned to face him fully. Someone was watching us. Maybe. Who? He didn't answer right away, but she already knew who it could be. Harlandic. She hadn't spoken his name aloud since before Roy's death, but it had hovered in the back of her mind like a rattler waiting in tall grass. He'd made her an offer once: sell the land or lose it. When she refused, he'd spit tobacco at her boots and ridden off, warning her she'd regret it. He hadn't shown his face since, but he'd always been a patient kind of menace. Clara's hands tightened around her shawl. You think he sent someone? I'd bet on it, Weston muttered, eyes narrowing toward the horizon. He's waiting to see if this place broke you. He'll be disappointed, she said, jaw clenched. Men like him don't like being told no. They wait for you to fall, and if you don't, they push you. She studied Weston's face, the shadows under his eyes, the scar near his jaw, the way he kept his back toward the wind. You've dealt with men like him before, she said. Plenty, and I outlived them. Later that day, Weston walked the fence line, hammering back broken posts and setting new wire where the old had been shredded by the wind. Clara followed behind slowly, helping when she could, her steps cautious with the weight of the child she carried. Every few minutes, she paused to rest, her breath coming shorter than usual. You need to sit, Weston said, glancing back. I'm fine, you're not. She exhaled sharply, but allowed herself to rest on a stump. I hate being helpless. You're not, he said, driving another nail. You're still here. She looked at him. How long do you think we have? Hard to say, but if Duck's sniffing around, it won't be long before he rides in bold. And when he does, Weston stood still, eyes sweeping across the ridge beyond the property. Then I stop running. His words were simple, but they landed hard. You've been running from something, haven't you? Yes. And you'd fight for this place? She asked. I'd fight for you, he said without hesitation. And that child. The air grew still. Clara felt something stir deep in her chest, equal parts fear and comfort. No one had spoken for her since Roy, and this man, this quiet stranger with pain in his eyes and calluses on his hands, was now drawing a line in the dirt on her behalf. The next morning, they heard the hooves. It started as a low thunder in the distance. Clara stepped onto the porch and froze. Weston stood beside her, already gripping the rifle. A single rider emerged from the far hills. Big man, clean-shaven, dressed in a tailored vest and fine boots no rancher wore. Harlandic. He didn't stop at the edge of the property. He rode up like he still owned the land, dismounted, and tipped his hat with mock courtesy. Well now, he drawled, ain't you a sight? Clara straightened. Get off my land, Harlan. He grinned, flashing gold in his teeth. Not yours, far as the county's concerned. You never filed Roy's transfer paperwork. Never paid title fees, far as the bank's concerned. This place is vacant. It's mine, she snapped. Roy said so. He promised a Roy's dead. Harlan cut in, voice flat. And promises don't mean squat to paper and lawmen. But I'm a fair man, Clara. I'll give you another offer. Walk away. I'll give you a place to stay. A roof. She's not leaving, Weston said. Duck's head turned. The amusement dropped from his face like a stone. You her new man? Or just some straggler sniffing around the last thing Roy left behind? Weston didn't answer. Dick looked him over and chuckled. You look like the kind that shoots first and regrets never. if you step foot past that fence," Weston said coolly, "you'll find out how right you are." A tense silence followed. Then, Harlan smiled again. "Well, we'll see who the dessert favors, then. But you've got to days. Then I come back with papers, with men, and with shovels if I have to." He mounted up, turned his horse, and rode off without looking back. Clara stood frozen on the porch, one hand resting over her belly. Weston stared at the dust trail disappearing into the hills. "He'll be back," she whispered. "I know. Then what do we do?" He turned to her, his voice like gravel underfoot. "We prepare." The night after Harlan's warning was the coldest Clara had felt in weeks. Not because the temperature had dropped, it hadn't. The air was still dry and heavy, the desert wind soft and warm, but something inside her had turned cold. That kind of fear that slipped into your bones without asking. She sat beside the fire in the small cabin, cradling a cup of tea made from dry dessert mint Weston had gathered weeks ago. Her belly pressed high beneath her ribs, now tight, uncomfortable, and constantly moving. The baby had been restless all day, almost like it sensed the tension in the air. Across the room, Weston worked silently. He'd oiled his rifle, checked every round in his satchel, sharpened both his hunting knife and his smaller blade. He moved like a man who knew violence wasn't a question of if, but when. "Is this what it felt like before your last fight?" Clara asked softly. He looked up, surprised. She clarified, "Wherever you were, whatever you used to do, you've fought men like Dick before, haven't you?" Weston nodded slowly. "Not always men like him. Sometimes worse, sometimes better." She sipped her tea. "I never asked what you used to be, but I can guess. You're too calm, too ready. You don't jump when a horse snorts or a board creaks. You watch everything." He gave a half smile, barely a twitch. "I was a scout once, then a gun for hire." Clara raised her eyebrows. "A hired gun?" He nodded, not proud of it. "But I didn't kill for sport, just survival." "You were good at it, good enough to still be breathing." They sat in silence for a while, only the fire crackling between them. Clara looked at the man who had walked into her life with nothing but a horse and a haunted look, and now sat across from her like a shield she hadn't asked for. "But maybe he'll come with others," she murmured. "Dick, I know men like him, cowards alone, brave in a pack." "I know," Weston said. "He'll wait till just before dark, when the shadows are long and men feel strong." Clara looked into the flames. "I should be terrified." "You're not." She paused. "I was, but not anymore." "Why?" She looked up and said, simply, "Because you're here." Weston's eyes flickered. He set down the blade he'd been working on and leaned forward. "I don't know how long I can stay," he said, voice quiet, rough. "I didn't plan on staying this long." She nodded. "I figured. I've ridden too many miles, left too much behind. There's always someone coming." "But you stayed," she said. "When I was dying in the dirt, when the storm hit, when I was alone. I stayed because I didn't want to lose another woman to something I could have stopped." She reached across the table, her hand resting on his. "But you also stayed because something in you still believes in redemption." He didn't pull away. They sat there, hand to hand, firelight flickering across their skin. "I was alone for so long," she whispered. "Even before Roy died, I felt like I was fading. And then when the baby came, it felt like a punishment, a burden. Now, it feels like purpose." Weston looked down at her hand. "When my son was born, I didn't know how to hold him. I was afraid I'd drop him, afraid I'd do something wrong. And then 2 breaths, that's all he took. I buried him before the sun rose." Clara's throat tightened. "You carry that with you every day." "I do." She leaned closer. "Then let me carry a little of it too." The words stunned him. No one had ever said that before. And for the first time since he arrived, Weston reached for her, not out of instinct or duty, but out of something deeper. He took her hand in both of his, rough calloused palms enveloping hers like armor around something soft. "You're not like anyone I've met," he said. "I could say the same." Later, as the fire burned low and the stars bloomed above the desert, Weston spread a blanket on the floor beside the door, rifle beside him. Clara lay in the cot, eyes wide open. "Weston," she whispered. "Yeah, if something happens tomorrow, if I don't make it, you'll make it. But if I don't," she continued, "promise me you'll take care of the baby. Get it off this land, somewhere safe." His voice was firm. "Nothing's going to happen to you. I won't let it." "That's not a promise." He stood, crossed the room, and knelt beside her. Then he whispered the first full sentence he'd spoken from the heart since he arrived. "I'm not going to lose you, Clara, not you, not this time." Her eyes stung. She reached up and touched his face. fingers brushing the edge of his jaw. Then don't run tomorrow, she said. Not for me. Fight. Stay. He nodded once, and in that moment, in the warmth of their silence, in the fire's dying glow, in the bond built not from passion, but pain, they weren't just strangers anymore. They were something stronger. They were a promise. The trouble didn't wait until dusk like Weston expected. It came early, just after noon, when the sun beat mercilessly down on the desert and the air shimmered with heat. Clara was in the cabin, resting, the baby shifting restlessly in her belly. Weston was oiling the hinges on the barn door when he heard the low rumble of hooves. He stood, rifle in hand, eyes narrowing toward the ridge. 3 riders, not a posse, not a full assault. A warning, and at the center of them, riding slow like he owned the very dirt under their boots, was Harlandic. Weston didn't move. He didn't raise his gun. Not yet. He watched. The 3 men rode up to the edge of the property, then slowed to a halt. Harlan didn't dismount this time. He just sat there, one hand resting lazily on the butt of his pistol. Morning, Dick called, voice slick as oil. Weston didn't respond. I see you've still got your boots planted here, Dick continued, mighty bold, considering the legal situation. You bring papers? Weston asked, voice low. Got 'em right here. Dick tapped his saddlebag. Deed says this land never passed to Clara Morgan. Her husband died without a signature. Means it reverts back to lien ownership. That'd be me. You're wrong. I don't need to be right. Dick smirked. Just need to outlast the people arguing with me. Weston stepped forward a few feet. You're not getting this. Land, you gonna shoot me over a patch of dirt and a tired widow, if I have to. One of Duck's men, a weary fella with a shotgun resting across his lap, spat into the dust. I don't like the way he talks. Don't need to like it, Dick said. He'll be gone soon enough. He looked past Weston, toward the cabin. That woman's carrying trouble, he added. A child with no future, and a house with no water. You think you're doing her a kindness? You're just delaying the fall. Weston's jaw flexed. Say one more word about her, Dick smirked. Truth hurts, don't it? That was it. Weston lifted the rifle just enough to make his meaning clear. Not to shoot, not yet, but he didn't have to. Dick raised both hands. All right, I came to deliver a message, not start a fight. But listen close. His voice dropped, suddenly venomous. If you're still here come sundown tomorrow, I'm not coming back with 3 men. I'm coming with 10, and I'm bringing fire. He yanked the reins, turned his horse, and rode off without waiting for a reply. The other 2 followed. Weston lowered the rifle slowly and breathed out. Inside, Clara had heard the voices. She was already at the window, one hand protectively cradling her belly, the other gripping the edge of the table. When Weston entered, she turned to him, her face pale. How long do we have? Till tomorrow night. She nodded once. Then we prepare. The rest of the day passed like a blur. Weston reinforced the cabin door with scrap iron and barnwood. He nailed planks across the lower windows. He set traps near the rear fence and stacked firewood in a half circle around the porch, where it could be lit in a moment's notice if they needed smoke for cover. Clara, refusing to sit still, boiled water, organized what few medical supplies she had left, and ground the remaining corn into meal for what might be their last hot meal before it all broke loose. As the sun dipped lower, Weston returned from the barn and handed her a small pouch. Ammo, he said. 6 rounds. For the pistol. Clara looked at it, then at him. I'm not using it unless I have to. You won't have to, Weston said. But if something happens, if I fall, you aim low and shoot until they drop. She didn't flinch. I won't let them take this place. It's not just the land, Weston said. They want the water. That spring is all that matters. Now, everything else is pride. Clara blinked. That's what this is, a water war. He nodded. Dick doesn't want a widow with a claim sitting on a spring when the rest of the county's dry. He doesn't care about you. He cares about owning the last flowing water this side of Red Ridge. She tightened her jaw. Then he'll have to bleed for it. Weston met her eyes and something like pride flickered there. You're braver than most men I've known, he said. I'm too stubborn to die, she replied. That night, as dusk sank like a stone behind the hills, Weston did one last check of the land. He stood at the fence line with the rifle in his hands, moonlight catching the steel. The sky was wide and quiet, but it didn't feel peaceful. It felt like the breath before a punch. When he returned to the cabin, Clara was seated near the hearth, rubbing her back. He knelt in front of her, hands resting lightly on her knees. You should rest, he said. She shook her head. I can't sleep, not tonight. Weston nodded. Then, for the first time since he'd arrived, He reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered, just for a moment. "I won't let anything happen to you," he said. "I know." They didn't kiss. They didn't cry. They just sat together. Two people who had lost too much and had too little left, but who had chosen, against all odds, to stand their ground. The firelight flickered between them. And outside, in the dark desert, the war for water, land, and a woman's right. They came at sundown. Just like Weston said they would. Clara stood inside the cabin, peering through a slit in the boarded-up window. Her breath shallow, a hand pressed protectively to her belly. The sky bled orange behind the hills, casting long shadows across the land. Dust curled low round the approaching Rider 7 this time. Armed, calm, confident, Harlandic rode in front. He wasn't in a hurry. Men like him didn't rush what they thought they already owned. Weston crouched behind the fence near the barn, his rifle braced on a post. He'd lined the edge of the property with dry brush, ready to ignite if needed. Beside him, the earth was packed with crude snares, traps he'd built overnight using old horse tack and wire. His eyes never left Dick. He didn't look at the men flanking him, or the rifles they carried, or the torch one of them lazily twirled in his grip. He just stared straight into the eyes of the man who thought power came from paperwork and muscle. Dick raised a hand. The riders halted. "I'll say it once," he called. "This land belongs to me now. You've had your chance to leave." Weston stood slowly, rifle still in his hands. "You'll die here," he said evenly, "if you step 1 foot closer." Duck's grin didn't waver. "That a threat?" "No," Weston said. "That's a certainty." One of the men to Duck's right raised his rifle and fired. The bullet clipped the barn. Weston didn't flinch. He answered with a single, clean shot. The rider who fired collapsed off his horse dead before he hit the ground. The rest of the men scrambled behind cover. Duck's smile dropped. Inside the cabin, Clara ducked low, heart racing. She counted the shots. 1, 2, then the thundering echo of hooves, shouting, screaming. She reached for the pistol Weston had given her and checked the chamber loaded. Safety off. Her palms were sweating. The baby kicked hard. "I know," she whispered. "I feel it too, outside." Weston moved like a shadow. He fired again. Another rider fell. He ducked, rolled, and disappeared into the corral, drawing 2 men after him. One of them triggered a snare and was yanked off his feet, screaming as he hit the ground hard. The other paused long enough to catch a rifle but to the jaw. Weston dropped him without hesitation. Smoke began to rise. One of the torches had found the dry brush. Flames crackled, fast and wild, forming a wall between the barn and the north edge of the house. Just like Weston planned out, it forced the riders toward the south fence into the bottleneck. Weston was already waiting. He fired again, missed but reloaded without a word. Then Dick stepped forward, hands raised, shouting over the fire and gunshots. "ENOUGH. This ain't a war. You're gonna burn this whole damn property down. It's not yours to burn." Weston shouted back, "I'll give you a final deal. Right now, walk away. I won't follow." Weston stepped from behind cover. "Neither will you." Clara heard the shouting and pressed closer to the window. She saw Weston step into the open, his face streaked with sweat and ash, his rifle raised. Then, she saw Harlandic do the same, hand on his revolver, slow and deliberate. This wasn't war now. It was a duel, the old kind. The kind the West didn't forgive or forget. Dick drew first, but Weston was faster. His shot hit Dick square in the chest, sending the man staggering backward off his feet, landing in the dust with a grunt. The revolver slipped from his hand. Clara gasped. The other riders hesitated, looked at one another. Then, they fled. Just like that. It was over. Weston stood over Duck's body, breathing hard, rifle still hot in his hands. He watched the man's chest rise one final time, and fall. Then, silence. No more hooves. No more shouting. Just smoke, drifting, and the sound of wind. Clara burst from the cabin, running despite the pain in her lower back and the weight of her unborn child. She found Weston near the barn, blood on his sleeve, a small cut above his eye. "You're hurt," she said, panting. "Not bad," he said. "You know, but it's time." He blinked. "What?" She doubled over, gripping his arm. "The baby," she gasped. "It's coming." And just like that, the war was over, but a new one had begun. The wind had finally died. The fire was out, reduced to smoke and blackened brush. The scorched remains of the southern fence smoldered as a red sun sank behind the hills, casting long, golden streaks over blood-stained dust. Weston carried Clara in his arms into the cabin, his boots crunching over grit and ash. She was breathing fast, sharp, urgent breaths. Sweat beaded on her forehead. Her face was pale, but her jaw was set with that same stubborn strength he'd seen from the moment they met. "It's happening," she gasped. "Now," he nodded. "We'll get through it. I need water, boil some. Tear fabric, get towels. Hurry." She didn't need to explain twice. Weston moved fast, more focused than ever before. He stoked the fire in the hearth, boiled what water they had left, laid out clean linens and rags. He opened the medical satchel and found the knife, sterilized it. His hands trembled once, then stilled. There was no time for fear, not this time. Clara lay back on the cot, one hand gripping the post, the other curled around her belly as waves of pain crashed through her. The contractions came fast, too fast, her breath caught, and she cried out. Weston dropped to her side, wiping her brow with a damp cloth. "You're doing good," he said, voice low and firm. You've done this before," she gasped. He hesitated. "I was there when it happened." Clara looked at him through sweat-matted hair. "You lost her. I won't lose you," he said. The labor was hard. The baby was turned wrong. Weston could see that even through his panic, but Clara stayed focused, biting down on the edge of a blanket, refusing to scream. Her fingers dug into his arm like nails. She pushed again, and then the sound, a cry, sharp, small, alive. Weston caught the baby in his hands and almost dropped to his knees. It was a girl, red-faced, wailing, fists clenched tight to the world that had already tried to take her before she even arrived. He wrapped her in a cloth and pressed her to Clara's chest. Clara sobbed, not in fear, not in pain, but in wonder. "She's beautiful," she whispered. Weston brushed a trembling hand over the child's head. "You both are." Hours passed. The baby suckled quietly. The cabin, once filled with gunfire and fury, now held only the crackle of the hearth and the softest sounds of life. Clara lay still, drained but breathing steady. Weston sat beside her, one hand resting on the cradle he'd built weeks earlier and nearly forgotten. Outside, the land was broken, the corral smashed, the fence burned, and yet inside, there was peace, for the first time in years. Clara stirred. "What do we name her?" Weston looked down at the baby's tiny face. "That's your choice." Clara smiled. "I want to name her Hope." He blinked, swallowed. "That's a good name," he whispered. Clara shifted slightly, gazing up at him. "You stayed. You didn't have to, but you did." "I couldn't leave," he said. "Not after I saw you digging that well. Not after I saw how hard you fought to live. You saved me." "No," Weston said, eyes never leaving the baby. "You saved me." Morning came slow and gold, casting light on everything the night had hidden. Clara stood with Weston on the porch, her arms wrapped around the sleeping bundle. The land was quiet now, scarred. But theirs. No lawmen came. No riders. No deke. Weston had buried the man himself at the edge of the far pasture, beneath a pile of unmarked stone. It wasn't mercy. It was closure. And now they had a future to build. "What happens now?" Clara asked, watching birds return to the fence line. "We rebuild," Weston said. "Fix the fence. Plant again. Maybe find a better well." Clara smiled. "You're staying, aren't you?" He looked at her. "If you'll have me." She leaned into him. "I never asked for a man. But if I had, it would have been someone like you." Weston didn't say anything. He just wrapped his arm around her shoulders and held her close. They weren't rich. They weren't safe from every hardship the desert would throw at them. But they had each other. A woman who refused to die. A man who chose to live again. And a child named Hope, born in the middle of dust and fire, proof that life always finds a way to rise.